Welcome everyone for one last time to Science Policy and Advocacy for STEM Scientists certificate course.
So next I'm going to call on Arti. So Arti, feel free to share your slides, and whilst you're doing so, I'll quickly introduce you. So Arti is the founder and chair of Engineers and Scientists Acting Locally. This is a national organization dedicated to increasing city, county, and state level engagement by professionals with backgrounds in STEM. She currently serves on the Community Service Commissions in the city of Hayward, California. We're not promoting local engagement or working with her fellow Hayward residents and municipal officials. Dr. Garg is the head of Advanced AI Solutions and Technology at Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. Prior to her current position, she worked across multiple industries and IoT verticals as a data scientist. In the past, she spent several years working as a policy advisor and analyst in the White House, as well as the US Congress. Dr. Garg holds a PhD in physics from Harvard University and an MS in aeronautical and astronautical engineering, as well as a bachelor's degree in physics and English from Stanford University. So with further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Arti for her talk.
I should unmute myself. Well, thanks so much, Rosie, for that great introduction. And thanks everyone for your patience. I joined a little bit late, but it looks like I made it just in time for my cue. I'm super excited to be able to be part of this module. And I'm super excited that the certificate program has a module explicitly focused on local government and local engagement, because I feel like this is an area that sometimes gets left out of the science policy discussion, despite it being an area where there's a lot of opportunity for people with STEM backgrounds who are interested in government and policy, and a lot of need. So, I'm thrilled to be here. So, to start though, before I kind of delve into some of the things you might want to consider from a local government and science policy perspective, if you've ever heard me speak, you've heard me talk about the fact that decisions are made by those who show up. You've probably heard this quote from me before. I don't know its full origin. I heard it on the West Wing and then, went into a dark internet hole trying to decipher its origin, didn't come up with it successfully. But the reason I think it's so important, and I always start ESAL conversations with this quote, is to remind people that if you really want to impact policy, it's an ongoing process. It's not a single discussion. It's an ongoing engagement with decision makers, with policy advisors, to help them navigate. Making policy can be, a multi-step process, and there's a lot of iteration, and there's a lot of compromise that happens along the way. And so if you really want to affect change, you need to be there to answer questions. You need to be there to show decision makers that the issue is important enough to you that you're willing to follow up, you're willing to stay engaged, you're willing to be a resource about it. And I think that, because of that, local engagement is such a valuable opportunity for people who are interested in policy with STEM backgrounds, because you may not live in Washington, you may live somewhere else, and it's a lot easier, especially I live in California, it's a lot easier to get to my city hall, which is about 10 minutes from my house, than it is to get to DC. And it's still easier to get to Sacramento than it is for me to get to DC. So even from the question of how can I have impact, it's much easier to do that locally. So but why do we exist? Why does an organization like Engineers and Scientists Acting Locally need to exist? Well, we conducted a survey a couple years ago asking engineers and scientists at many different career stages about their interest in civic engagement. And overwhelmingly, people self-reported that yes, they would be interested in increasing their local engagement levels with government. And by local, we tend to include like city, regional / county and state governments. However, despite overwhelming interest in doing this, the reality is that the actual numbers don't bear this out. People are far more engaged at the federal level and at the state level than they are at sort of the regional and county level. And that becomes more apparent when you move away from the way we've divvied this up as election participation or general engagement. Maybe you've read about a policy and you start to talk about direct engagement. That's kind of unusual because it should be easier to get to your city council than it is to get to your congressperson's office. However, the opposite is true. You're more likely to have visited your member of Congress than you are to have met with the city council member. And, on top of the engagement disparities, what we've also found is that scientists and engineers self-report feeling less informed. Most people consider themselves highly informed on federal issues, but most people don't consider themselves highly informed on municipal issues. So there's clearly a knowledge barrier in why preventing people from engaging at the local level. So that's sort of why we came into being, and engineers and scientists acting locally. As Rosie pointed out, we're an all volunteer organization. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, and we love new volunteers. Rosie is a volunteer, and Adriana sometimes writes for us as well. So we are engineers and scientists who have experience in public policy, trying to inspire more engineers and scientists to think broadly about what they can do in the policy realm. So just kind of very briefly to talk about what are the pathways to engaging in the local government and local policy making. I think that, again, people, sort of to Adam's point, people are very familiar with the AAAS program as an avenue for making a career change into the federal government, but it's not, the only way to have an impact, both from a career transition standpoint and also from if you don't want to make a career transition. Engineers and scientists who are practicing as researchers or technologists in industry can contribute a lot to policy discussions, even without being in Washington, without working full-time for some kind of organization that's like much more policy focused. And one of the things that I like to talk about is that those are both opportunities to consider, both as a student and as you go forward in your career. As you got from my bio, I was a AAAS fellow. That's how I found my way to Washington. I spent several years full-time employed as a policy analyst, and now I'm not. I work in industry. I work in AI solutions and pretty technical role. So when I think about what are the pathways for engaging, some of it depends a little bit also on what you want to do. Do you want to be a policy advocate? Do you want to serve government broadly? Or do you really have specific areas of expertise you want to make an impact with? And it's useful to think about these as sort of three categories or ways, avenues to making an impact. So I'm not going to delve into details too much, but I'm happy to answer questions. And if you guys get these slide decks, actually, there's links that a lot of these things connect to. But a few ways to engage in policy advocacy, if you want to include making public comments. So this is typically if you were to go to a city council meeting or some kind of open discussion of government processes, it's a way to stand up and say, I either support what the council is working on right now, or say, you know what, the council should really be taking up this issue. They haven't. I've done both. And it is, you do get responses from that. It can be quite effective. The other way is to meet with local officials. So, go in, schedule meetings. Often you want to meet with staff, not necessarily elected representatives, but if that's a little bit, depends on what level of government and what you're trying to do. But that can be a great way of informing your local government around an issue that you want them to make a policy change. And then finally, volunteering with grassroots organizations. And be a great way if there's some organization in your community that is already advocating for a policy change you'd like to see happen, working with them, maybe even encouraging them to adopt more evidence-based arguments into what they're doing can be extremely effective and a way to sort of build on interest in a particular policy outcome that might already exist in your community. So those are just three avenues, and you can see most of these are not full-time career options. Another, if you want to, instead of have a specific policy outcome that you want to advocate for, but you really want to serve your government in some way and maybe have a broader set of ideas or policy topics that you're willing to work on, a couple different options include serving on an advisory body. So Rosie mentioned that I'm a city commissioner. I first started off as a city task force member. And this is a great volunteer way to have an impact. And I'll talk a little bit more about my service actually a couple slides down from now. Another alternative is actually to join and work for a local government. This picture over here is of a meeting that's being held in the Louisville Metro government buildings, and it's being run by an ecologist who works for the Louisville Metro government and is heavily involved with figuring out how to redevelop brownfield sites in that community. And then of course, run for office. That may be the one that comes to mind first when you think about government service, which is why I also would like to emphasize some of these other avenues to get involved with local government. And then finally, expert guidance. You've got some kind of expertise, technological, scientific, what have you, and you believe that your government could benefit from it. So once again, public comments, usually written public comments that might be on, say, a permitting application. And maybe you're an ecologist or an environmental scientist who can talk about how a development project might impact the local ecosystem. That's a really effective way of actually introducing science into some kind of government decision-making process. As Adam pointed out, try to advise government officials. There are some formal mechanisms, most importantly, I think state level policy fellowship programs, but there are a lot of informal avenues to advising government officials. And it can be anything from an internship that you create. I've linked to a story of somebody who's doing that, to something like I have a number of city council members that call me up occasionally if they have like a quick question about something. So it doesn't have to be a huge time commitment if you don't want it to be. Another way is to testify in a hearing. Usually you have to have sort of an established relationship with a government official to be called to testify in a hearing, but that's clearly a way to provide some expertise. Those are typically more relevant at the state level than at sort of the city or county level. And then, I mentioned advisory bodies. There are some advisory bodies that have appointed positions that are typically reserved for subject matter experts. So they could be working groups on specific policy areas, or they could be broader advisory panels. And those are other avenues for providing expertise to a local government. So that's kind of a high level overview. I'm just going to dive into one specific example, which is my own city commission service. So I'm serving, while I've been engaged with the City of Hayward's government for many years, I'm serving on the Community Services Commission since 2018. And it's a participatory budgeting committee. We make recommendations for how the city should distribute community services and social services funds. So that can include anything from housing development projects for people who are facing homelessness or housing insecurity, to things like food services for food insecurity, or health services for low-income residents. And I just want to point out, because again, sometimes there's not a lot of clarity about what's involved, but the required engagement level is 8 meetings per year. They are in the evenings on a Wednesday, and they're about 2 hours each, and they're monthly, except for the months we're not meeting. And then one Saturday review session to meet with applicants for this funding. And so it's not this insane amount of investment. There are commissions that have less time requirements, and then the planning commissions tend to be much heavier in terms of time requirements. But I just want to point that out. It's something that actually graduate students can do. I've had, there is a law student currently on my community services commission, so don't rule this out as an option. It's a great way to learn about government and what it really takes to sort of move the needle from a policy perspective. from this commission, there's also some optional additional service that you can do. You can serve on an ad hoc committee. I have 2 years in a row, usually 3 to 5 extra meetings, and it's a little bit more informal because at the end of the day, you report back to the official commission, so it can work more around people's schedules. And then, you know, go to defend your recommendations in front of the city council. So attend that city council meeting is optional, but highly encouraged. So not a lot of time commitment, but just kind of to give you an idea of the type of impact you can have from this type of engagement. I was talking about in the last 2 years, impact that I have had, things that probably wouldn't have happened if I weren't on the commission. And bear in mind, this is a community services and social services commission. I'm a physicist and aerospace engineer by training. And so, you know, the point being that any kind of technical background and ability to look at studies and sort of parse technical information can be valuable, especially at the local level. So, you know, a couple areas of direct impact that I've had is that after the first funding round that we went through, I sort of raised my hand and said, you know, the application process that we have, the information we're asking for, and some of the selection criteria, I don't think it's really, one, getting us the information we need from a decision-making perspective, and 2, leading to the outcomes we want. So a few of us formed a subcommittee to make recommendations to the full committee, and we, you know, really streamlined the application process, and we made one change that was actually, you know, allowable even under, a lot of this money comes from the Housing and Urban Development Department in the federal government, but it was allowable even under HUD rules. In one small change, and it almost doubled our applications, gave us a lot more information about, say, the race and ethnicity demographics of the people that applicants were serving, and allowed for a lot of innovative new programs to apply. So that's just one, you know, background that came from my work in data. I guess I used to work in the, you know, at OMB, so I think a lot about how and why people spend money, but that's just one thing that raising my hand once at a commission kicked off. Another thing is that I served this past year on another ad hoc subcommittee to put together a set of recommendations for city council around how to improve our city's racial equity that may not seem like part of the charter of a participatory budgeting committee, but it actually is. And so this wasn't my idea, but I served on the ad hoc committee. And I think by serving on it, I was able to make some there was some interest in talking about the use of force and also the use of certain types of policing technology, in particular the use of AI and facial recognition technology. Because of my background as a scientist, I was able to sort of make some arguments around what data exists on the use of force, and then also more, you know, pointed recommendations around the use of AI in policing. And then finally, my first funding round, or actually 2 different years, both funding for early intervention programs for HIV and for domestic violence. There was we were always oversubscribed, and so there was a desire to cut these programs. And because I just happened to be familiar, not even from like the published research, but from like sort of general science reading of, you know, why these programs are important and how they affect a lot of the other things that we're talking about, I was able to make the case to kind of preserve those fundings. And then indirectly through relationships that, you know, this type of commission has helped me build with city council, and what city council has learned about my interest in, say, like food insecurity. I consulted with a sort of the county food bank and a couple of different government entities to do a better job of asking. You know, early in the COVID epidemic, we needed to get an understanding of who needed food and what their, you know, how easily they could go and get it from someplace was, because the food bank was closed down. So I made some, like, I thought very minor recommendations, but they ended up being used widely. I just received that survey as part of the school district survey on school lunches as well. So, I mean, you'd be surprised, like as a scientist, you have some understanding of how you're going to use information and data. And so that was just, you know, seems like a small thing, but it obviously had a lot of impact. And then there's a couple other areas where council members have asked me to weigh in, working with one council member to think about, how do we make it easier for, say, like shelters and food banks to have better like websites and other types of technical resources that could help them be better agencies serving the public. So that's just 2 years of service on a city commission. Because it's small, because there's lots of need, there's a lot of opportunity to have an impact. And I think sometimes we don't understand that, but it's true. And so, yeah, I'm just gonna leave it at that, and happy to answer questions in the Q&A. I mentioned engineers and scientists acting locally. We have a blog to share people, ideas, and organizations to help you learn more about various topics, both ways to engage and particularly, understanding the local dimensions of policy issues. We have a lot of resources on our website. We also hold events. We had an event last week on voting and the use of science and technology in election integrity. We have an upcoming event on how student groups are responding to COVID in their communities. And we also do conference sessions. We're going to have workshops at the National Science Policy Symposium. So lots of opportunities to, we're all volunteers. Our goal is just to make this easier for you guys. And I won't go into this, but there's a lot of us. We would love for you to join us as well if you're interested. And that's it. I also have my email address down at the bottom here if you guys want to reach out to me. And please sign up for our newsletter as well.